What's up, guys? Coach Gary Leon here. This is another edition of our supplemental exercise series. So we're going to go over some different techniques on how to improve your primary lifts using some special exercises. So all these exercises are going to be variations of the main competition lifts. Today we're talking about the deficit deadlift. So before we kind of go into the actual execution of the lift, I want to just preface by saying all this is kind of context specific. In general, if you are not a competitive power lifter, or you don't really care about increasing your 1 rep max deadlift, I don't think the deficit deadlift is kind of worth the cost. Every exercise has a cost and a benefit. So for me, the deficit deadlift is a little bit more on the riskier side of exercises because it's going to put a little bit more stress on the low back, especially if done improperly. So it's really important that you have sufficient mobility. Good to kind of test if you're able to if you're even able to do a conventional deadlift off the floor, let alone a deficit deadlift. Just make sure you have adequate, this is called an active straight leg raise. So for here, we want to make sure that you're somewhere between 70 to 90 degrees of hip flexion with a straight knee. And you can obviously check both sides here. So that's kind of a good general kind of rule. If you have somewhere between 70 to 90 degrees of hip flexion, then you should be able to perform the conventional deadlift off the floor, and then eventually progress into a deficit deadlift where you're elevating your legs, so it's going to be an extended range of motion. In general, that's just a good mobility test to see if you have enough hip flexion to kind of get down in a good position. And the same would go for like a stiff-legged deadlift as well. So make sure you have the adequate mobility before you kind of try this exercise. Make sure that your regular conventional deadlift and stiff leg deadlift form is good off the floor. So your positioning is good off the floor. So the way we would like to use a deficit deadlift is there's two kind of primary ways you can use a deficit deadlift. You can do a deficit stiff leg deadlift, which we rarely seldom use, or you can just do a deficit deadlift where you're kind of exaggerating your hips down. So since you're elevating, since you're standing on a platform, it's going to extend the range of motion. So this does a couple of different things. When we're talking about isometrics and kind of starting strength and things like that, a lot of kind of research has shown, and from my past experience, when you're doing some sort of isometric or some sort of like overcoming isometrics, so like kind of starting off a deadlift, things like that, you're going to kind of strengthen the range of motions 15 degrees above and below the position. So the thought is, if your sticking point or your weakness is off the floor, since the deficit deadlift is kind of below where you would be off the floor, then the deficit deadlift is going to help your start. That being said, I think it's really important that if that's the thought process, that your technique needs to kind of mimic that. So in my opinion, you'll have a higher transfer if you keep a good starting position. So what I mean by that is if you're performing a deficit deadlift with the intent of helping build the start, specifically kind of leg drive in a conventional deadlift. So if you look at somebody like an Eric Lillibridge, for example, really any good strongman, they use a lot of quad, they use a lot of leg power to get the bar moving off the floor. And although their hips may kind of come up slightly before the bar actually breaks the floor, you can see they're really using their quads a lot to really start the lift. And I find that is probably the best way to start a conventional deadlift. Of course, depending on your anthropometry and your femur length, it's going to dictate a lot of things as well. But in general, you're going to have some dorsiflexion, you're going to have some forward knee travel in the conventional deadlift for most people, depending on how you're built, and you're going to have to use your legs and your kind of quads to help break the bar off the floor. Otherwise, you're essentially just performing a very hip-dominant movement and you're just performing a stiff-legged deadlift. So it's really important when you're doing a deficit deadlift that you maintain proper position off the floor. So if you look at, we'll throw some clips in as well, but when I'm performing a deficit deadlift, I'm really trying to exaggerate and almost think about squatting the weight up. And that way you're kind of really focusing on a leg drive off the floor. If not, if you're performing a stiff leg deficit deadlift, there's some benefit to that, and it's going to really overload the hamstrings. It's going to create a very large moment arm at the back. But in my opinion, most people don't have the flexibility and the ability to keep a neutral spine in that position. Now, if you're trying to work the hamstring from the lower back, having a greater stretch and having a larger moment arm between the barbell and the hip and extended range of motion is going to be very beneficial. But in my opinion, if you're going to do a stiff leg, you're probably better off just doing a stiff leg off the floor, as most people are going to get plenty of range of motion just out of that, because most people don't have even the hip flexion range of motion to handle that, your average person, of course. So now that we kind of understand why we're doing a deficit deadlift, we're trying to train the starting position of a conventional deadlift. And we're specifically speaking about the conventional deadlift, and we'll get into the differences if sumo deficits are appropriate or not. I'll give my opinion on that. You have to figure out an appropriate height. So I understand not everyone has access to this, but if you're a gym owner watching this, or you're looking to purchase some of your own equipment, we like to use these DC blocks. You can get these at EliteFTS.com. These are somewhere between 1 and 2 inches. I think they're about a 1.5 inch step. I like to actually use 2 of them because I'm a large person. Even though I've lost a lot of weight, I'm still pretty large, so I like to kind of stand on 2 side by side. If for some reason you wanted to go up to a 3-inch deficit, you could stack these together, but for 99% of the time, we're just going to use 1. And I find this is a very good height, and it's pretty sturdy platform. You could stack these, and we will also use these for low block pulls and mid block pulls as well. So it serves many purposes. So if you're doing any type of block training, whether you're a power lifter or a weight lifter, I think these are great. And these have held up pretty well. So this one's actually a little bit older model, so this has some cracks in it, but if you do get any cracks, we've had like over 700 pounds in these, and we've had no problems. So, and that's from a block pull standpoint. So in the case of the deficit, you're just going to stand on this guy. So for me, I like to maybe stand a little bit wider sometimes, so my feet aren't touching the edge. So we could set up kind of 2 blocks side by side. So it looks something like this for those wider people. And I'll just kind of stand here, and I'll perform the deficit deadlift like that. Again, when I'm performing the deficit deadlift, I don't want to do a stiff leg. I want to set my hips a little bit lower than normal, and then do it that way. Now, let's say you're not fortunate enough to have DC blocks. There's a couple of different options. So in general, I like to start people off with a 45-pound plate. This one happens to be very good. So this is flat. So I wouldn't want to stand on it for like this side, because that's not going to be an even surface. But if I stand on the plate like this, as you can see, this is a little closer to 1 inch, so this is a little bit thinner. So this would be a good height to start at for someone who's newer to deficit deadlifting. And then I could progress to something like a DC block. But if you don't have a DC block, I just recommend just stand on a 45-pound plate. That'll give you some variety and allow you to extend the range of motion just a little bit, and it'll still be significant, especially as you increase the poundages. You could also use a 100-pound plate or a bumper plate. So this is, as you can see, a little bit thicker still. So this is closer to maybe 2 inches or even above. I would never really go past this height. I know some people do, but I just don't think, again, the risk is worth the reward in that case. So those are some different options if you don't have access to the DC blocks, but I think the DC blocks are your best option. So those are some different. So in general, you want to use somewhere between a 1 to 2 inch height. Another option, which I've done quite a bit as well, I haven't done in a while. You could also use weightlifting shoes if you just for whatever reason you don't want to stand on something. So most weightlifting shoes will be somewhere between a 1/2 inch to up to 1 inch, and obviously it's not going to be a full, but this is going to create some sort of a deficit. And what's cool about having you on a little bit of an angle, it's going to kind of force your knees forward a little bit more, give you a little bit more ankle range of motion, and make the lift a little bit more quad dominant off the floor. So while I don't really recommend pulling in weightlifting shoes when going really heavy, I'm not really a big advocate for that. I know there are some coaches that may disagree. Unless you're a weightlifter, if you're a power lifter, I think just being closer to the ground and shortening the range of motion is going to be beneficial. But if you wanted to do a deficit deadlift or like a snatch grip deadlift, so a snatch grip deadlift, maybe we'll talk about in another video, but that's another way to extend the range of motion. You could do those in combination. So you can certainly wear a weightlifting shoe, and that's another way to create a deficit as well indirectly. How heavy should you go on these and things like that? When I did West Side training, I would do this. I would have this in a max effort rotation. When I was pulling like when I was at my strongest, and I was pulling like mid 600s conventional, my best deficit deadlift was around like 570. So that was a good indicator lift for me if my deficit deadlift was going up. Usually my normal deadlift was going up as well. I seldom go do these very heavy anymore. I know, so a lot of Dan Green's lifters at Boss Barbell Club, they like to do these very heavy. But in my opinion, and it works for them, obviously they have a lot of great deadlifters. that train out of that gym, really world class. In my opinion, for the, barring those outliers and barring, people that are really new, the people that are kind of more in the middle of the bell curve, I think most people are going to get their best bang for the buck and somewhere in like that 5 to 8 rep range, and doing this as a secondary barbell movement. And sometimes in an off-season phase, we might do these belt lifts, we might do these as a primary movement, but in general, it's probably going to be a secondary barbell movement, a supplemental exercise that you'll do after your primary deadlifting exercise for the day. And you can do anywhere from, I would say anywhere from 2 to 5 sets of anywhere from 5 to 8 repetitions. Typically, if we're going really higher reps and higher volumes, we'll use straps for this as well. And yeah, so if you're a bigger guy, some other considerations, you may need to go a little bit of a wider stance. You may need to widen out your grip a little bit because your belly can certainly get in the way if you're a bigger guy. I definitely had this problem myself when I was bigger. But those are some general guidelines for the deficit deadlift. Some other ways that you can artificially create a deficit if you are like an RPS lifter or a USPA lifter uses, or just any federation that uses a deadlift bar. Very simple way you can create a deficit, and it's going to be very small, besides standing on something, besides wearing a heel, is using a stiff bar in training. By using a stiff bar in training, it's going to allow you to not pull the slack out as much, and it's going to make you force you to pull the weight a little bit longer than you would if you're using a deadlift bar where there's more flex in it. So if you want to combine, if you want to really underload, a really great exercise in the off season or during a hypertrophy phase would be a stiff bar, beltless deficit deadlifts, because it's going to allow you to have a very high muscular stimulus, and you're not going to need a lot of weight to get a great return on your investment. So that's kind of like how I like to use a deficit deadlift. And going into the sumo pull, if you have really good hip mobility and you have very healthy hips, you could certainly try it. In general, I like to use this as a leg and back builder. So I'd say 99% of the time I will use this in the conventional stance, but you could certainly try it sumo. I just find that it tends to usually beat the hips up too much in general, and I find that the sumo block pull, where the weights are elevated, has a higher transfer, and it's a little easier to maintain form. Since the conventional deadlift is less technical than the sumo deadlift, if you're a little bit out of position on the deficit pull, I don't think it's going to really mess with your mechanics as much, whereas if you're doing a deficit sumo deadlift, it's going to be even harder to maintain good position, and I do think it can throw off the mechanics a lot. If you don't want it to turn into like a sumo stiff-legged deadlift, unless that's your intention. So that could really kind of mess with your overall mechanics, and I don't think for people that are especially trying to learn sumo, I just don't think that that's a good trade-off, in my opinion. If you're really proficient in the technique, you have really good hip mobility and really healthy hips, again, you can certainly try it. I would advocate, if you wanted to do like a deficit sumo deadlift, just use a stiff bar in training, and that's a good way that you can kind of have a slight deficit. That's something I definitely learned from Dan Green. Again, a lot of great deadlifters after that. So you can use a stiff bar in training, and that's going to kind of create like a little bit of an artificial deficit. Even if it's an inch or half an inch difference, it does make the start harder, and that's kind of the whole point of the sumo of the deficit deadlift. Anyways, just to kind of train for a little bit of a harder start. So that's all about the deficit deadlift. Just to kind of recap some different points. If you want to use the deficit deadlift to kind of help train your start, it's my opinion that you should have an exaggerated hips lower, trying to get your hips lower so that way you can practice a leg drive off the floor. If you want to do a stiff leg deadlift, just understand that's going to be a separate movement in itself, and it's not necessarily going to have a higher transfer. It's going to be good for a muscular stimulus to train your back and hamstrings more, but it may not give you the mechanical, the technical practice of having a good start and building your leg drive off the floor. So just understand how you perform the lift is going to have a difference in how it transfers over to the competition lift, in my opinion. This is what we've kind of found works really well. So if you're someone that struggles off the floor and struggles with leg drive specifically off the floor, the deficit conventional deadlift can be a great option for you. Start with about an inch deficit where you're standing on something. You can progress to 1.5 inch or 2 inches as you get more proficient. Make sure you have good amount of hip flexion to try that active straight leg raise test. Give these a try if you're a competitive powerlifter, if you're trying to improve your 1 rep max and you struggle off the floor. So that's how to do conventional deficit deadlifts. Hope you liked the video. Please share it if it helped you. Please subscribe to the channel if you want more content. Check out the links below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, stay strong, and we'll see you soon.